Thank you for joining iMeet. This meeting is now being recorded.
Well, that's a new voice. I haven't heard her before. Welcome, everyone. I'm David Hadibus, and I'm sitting here today with Richard Kinney. Richard's head of Global Contact Center Marketing with Plantronics. He's based out of the UK, so we appreciate these time zone challenged video interviews, and we really appreciate you taking a few minutes with us today, Richard. Each time we talk to Richard, we try and approach things a little differently, a little different discussion, different perspectives. He was just explaining to me that he's got 14 years of contact center knowledge crammed into that brain, travels all over the globe and sees a number of different operations and issues. And so today we're going to focus more on some people aspects. We do hear a lot of discussion in CCNG program events about retention. It's hard enough finding good people. Treating them well and keeping them around is a big challenge for a number of operations. So we'll get into that in a moment, but I thought we'd start off, since we're here in the new year, we'll start off with a little bit of 2017 predictions. That way we can look forward in a year and see how off base I was and Richard was. But anyway, so Richard, welcome. Good morning. Thanks for taking time. Why don't you give us a quick overview of what you see coming in the new year?
I think it should come as no real surprise to anybody that 2017 will probably be the year of risk and uncertainty and how organizations deal with that uncertainty. We've seen a number of political decisions that haven't gone as expected, both in the UK, the US. We're seeing them in the Far East as well. And I think what that's translating to for businesses is a level of uncertainty. And businesses generally don't like uncertainty. They like a pretty solid climate going forward. So what we're hearing at a sort of reasonably high level is a risk management approach coming through in a number of companies, moving away a little bit from this idea of aspirational. Where am I going to be in 7 years' time? What's my real big high-level goal? To a perspirational approach. How am I going to make the assets, the people that I've got now, work hard? How am I going to get the most out of them? How am I going to keep them going? And more of a sort of practical, a tactical approach to business going forward. So that's what I'm sort of picking up at a pretty high level globally. It would be interesting to see if that's something that you're picking up from your customers locally as well.
You know, it's interesting. We kick off our year with meetings usually starting in February. We do a lot of virtual events and discussion early part of the year. And a lot of the topic is around stability, I guess, and maybe that's something similar to what you're talking about. Keeping the wheels on the carts, keeping a short-term focus. Last year, there was a lot of discussion on employee engagement. I think that the next level of that is really just making sure we're doing the job well internally, taking care of our house. And a little less interest in bells, whistles, glitz, and glamour, and a lot more interest on digging deeper and really taking that employee as well as the customer relationship a little deeper. So I think those things kind of dovetail. And it certainly dovetails into what you want to talk about today, which is, hey, where are there risks inherent with the way customers are doing business with us today, reaching out to us, that maybe didn't exist 5 years ago? And I'm speaking of mobile communication and how the large percentage of customers reach out to you. It's no surprise that the younger the customer, the less likely that the phone is their first channel. But by golly, when they're ready to call, they're calling, and they may be standing in the middle of a ball game or something. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about what that means and what you see in the contact center, and specifically, how can we reduce some of that risk, inherent risk that maybe didn't exist a few years back?
Yeah, I think you've got it spot on right there. There's a couple of really significant trends that are taking place. A couple of them I think one of them we've already discussed, which is this idea that the phone call is an escalation. We used to predict that the number of phone calls would actually go down, but we're not seeing that when we ask our customers. We're not seeing that when we look at some of the statistics around business communication. So the number of phone calls is staying the same, but their purpose is very much shifting up to an escalation. The first channel is normally a digital social channel, and then that phone call is an escalation, so something's gone wrong at that point. And like you said, that phone call is usually an escalation on a mobile device. If I look at the statistics of our own TAC team, about 70–75% of the calls coming in are from mobiles. So the quality of network may not be as high as compared to a pretty solid landline they're coming in on. Plus, there's a high level of background noise that may be taking place. So that combination of potentially quite a stressed customer, a high level of risk and uncertainty around them, plus this mobile network means that we predict there's going to be a rise in employees almost taking the brunt of some of this. If it's a digital interaction, you can ignore it reasonably easily. It doesn't have that much of a physical impact on you. But if someone is angry and shouting at you down the phone because something's not working, or if somebody calls in and there's a lot of background noise going on because, like you said, they're in a ball game, they could be on public transport, they could be anywhere in public. So what we see is going to happen is that employees and organizations are going to become much more aware of these risks around acoustics coming into the calls. We've actually seen this in Europe for quite some time now, and we've also seen it in our Australia, New Zealand, particularly Australia arm, that there are certain amounts of legislation around acoustics on a call. And those acoustic legislation aims are not really about improving the quality of the call. They're really about looking after the employee. And for organizations, there's a double benefit here. If that call coming in is an escalation, you want a higher level of employee looking after that. You want that employee to be really good because that call coming in is an exception. If it's a routine transactional call, the organization can deal with that through self-service. So what you want now is a much higher level, higher trained employee that can deal with all of these exceptions and follow them through. And obviously those employees are generally worth a lot more to your business. So if they do go off sick for whatever reason, then you're going to miss them an awful lot more. There's also quite a financial cost. I think it's around about $10,000 to replace employees. So if they're finding that the work coming into them is pretty stressful, if they can't hear the customer clearly because of the background noise, or if there's lots of sudden high sounds that are quite stressful to deal with sometimes, then you can find that they may leave and they may go somewhere else. So we're seeing that as a real focus for organizations coming forward, is protecting those higher value employees from this, I call it nascent or rising acoustic area at the moment. Some of the legislation in Europe is all about the noise exposure through the day. But what we're finding is there's quite a lot of research around sudden sounds. So if an employee gets shouted at by a customer, if a customer is on the street and a car goes past with a siren going, it's a very sudden sound there. Now, those sort of sudden sounds have actually been protected against for quite some time in our headsets. We've had protection in them for about 40 years now. But what we're finding is that organizations are now being asked to prove that. If I look at some of the best practice, and some of that emerges from the federal government, the local government, people who generally tend to have a bit of a higher care approach to some of their employees, that public sector area. What we find is they have almost an acoustic policy. What should be the settings on all my devices end to end? Should my phones reset to a different or middle volume level after every call? How do I look after my headsets, and what headset settings have they got? So, the first thing that employers have to really look at is what's that headset or what's that acoustic policy? Because unfortunately, what we've seen is that in many cases, there can be outside legal parties get involved quite quickly on these occasions. So if you have a really sudden sound, some of the medical research says actually that can be a little bit damaging in the short term. That can make employees quite stressful, quite nervous. If you picture it, if somebody creeps up behind you now and bursts a balloon behind you, your body sort of tenses up quite a lot, and it sets you on edge for a little bit of time.
Sure.
And if you're not really expecting it, then that actually can last up to 8 weeks, the symptoms of that. And if an employee is missing for 8 weeks because of that stress or that sickness, that's a really big gap in your ability to deliver customer service. So what we think is the sort of best practice approach now that we're starting to see coming through is an idea of proactive. How do I show to my employees, how do I show to my occupational health and safety teams that I have got a good protection strategy in place, both in terms of the device configuration end to end, what's happening all the way through my network, what's happening in my acoustic environment, but then also what am I doing to actually get rid of some of these incidents off the network. Now, like I said, this is we've seen this a fair bit coming up in Europe and Australia, and I do expect to see it happening in North America now as well. Like I said, especially led by that federal government, local government area, just to really make sure they're looking after those employees.
Not something we've been hearing a lot, and it's kind of opens up a number of questions. You talked about risk around acoustics, legislation, possibilities, and acoustic policy. In your opinion, or from what you've seen, who would own it inside the organization? Who would own the acoustic policy or enforce, I guess?
So there's probably a number of different areas. It may start off with your facilities manager, believe it or not.
Really?
If you look around you in any typical contact center, many of them are trying to move towards this more open plan environment that is encouraging collaboration between employees to give them a little bit more visibility of what's going on. The trouble is many of them are just tearing down the barriers. And what that does is it raises the acoustic noise floor across that contact center. You'll start to see it in a lot of articles about how open plan offices are actually encouraging sickness and they're discouraging collaboration because the noise level's so high. And we see that in contact centers as well, that the noise floor is high and people are forced to listen at much higher levels just to hear clearly what the customer is saying. So that first step is really that facilities manager who's looking after the contact center. The second step is occupational health and safety teams. Generally, they probably haven't had much in working with the contact center. They probably look at the wider, maybe the manufacturing areas of the business. But if you're thinking that this potentially, if you look at some of the medical research, has an impact on employee health, if you get it wrong, then there's a real approach there that these occupational health and safety teams need to get proactively involved with the contact center. And what you really don't want to be doing is being on the back foot with these teams and having to prove things, retrospectively. If you've got an approach in place that lets you monthly engage with them, show them full reports about how everything's configured end to end, you're going to have a much better relationship with them. And there's a sort of bit of cutting edge research that says actually if the employees are aware of this, there's less stress because the employees know that they're being looked after. And what we've seen in the research is that if employees are stressed, they actually are much more likely to suffer from these acoustic incidents. It's an indicator that they're one of these incidents where if they take place, they're much more likely to have a higher or worse reaction to them.
So let me ask one more question. We've had a number of members just recently share with us that 2017 is an exciting year for them. They're going to be opening up new contact center operations expanded. In one case, they were saying that we're moving 2,200 people into a new facility that will look completely different than the environment that they constructed in the 90s. So when you take a 20-year leap like that, at what point do you start looking at this in the design phase? Do you have any experience in that in new centers and what makes sense as a best practice?
If you've got the opportunity, then working it in the design phase is excellent. What we've seen, or what we've heard from one of our consultants, is that most contact centers and most buildings are designed by eye. They're not designed by the ear. So they're designed to look really good, but if you walk into them and you see high ceilings, you see low barriers, no carpets on the floor, it's just all these reflective surfaces that increase the noise level. And what we found is that actually if you get in the design phase, if you put in what we call an ABC approach, which is absorption, blocking, and control. And absorption is barriers, it's plants, it is wall coverings, it's carpets, it's ceiling tiles that are designed to absorb noise and not reflect it. One little thing that we've done in a lot of our own internal contact centers is that we do a three-way setup for seating, so that you're never directly looking opposite someone. So if your voice is projecting, it's never projecting directly at somebody, it's projecting into a gap between two other people. It doesn't take up any more space than any of the other classic seating patterns that we've seen, but it really helps with acoustics. Blocking could be sort of simple sound barriers between people. We put low barriers in between people just to sort of make sure that they've got some barriers to acoustic noise. And the last one is what we call coverage, which is white noise generation at its most simple. There's lots more complicated solutions coming to market, but what we find is with simple white noise generators, they stop the gaps between conversations. So there's a constant low-level noise that stops people getting distracted. So that whole ABC approach really leads to a much better acoustic environment for the contact center. There's actually a statistic. If you want to get out in your contact center, there's a number of apps that you can get on your phone that measure the background noise. Oh, and an employee needs to have about 20 decibels gap between the background noise and the level they're listening at in the headset to make it really legible. So we think a really good level of sound coming into the ear is something that's below about 80, 85 decibels. So you need a noise level in the contact center that's about 60 decibels at the most. So if you're measuring your background noise at your busiest time and it's higher than 60, 65 decibels, you do not have an optimal acoustic setup there for your contact center, and your employees are probably going to be struggling to hear the customer. They're going to see longer call times. They're going to be a lot more stressed because they're really having to concentrate hard to listen to those conversations that are taking place.
Sure, sure. We've all called into those centers where you hear a tremendous amount of background noise, and your first impression is that the person who's trying to hold my hand through this service experience is distracted at best. That adds stress on both the customer side, I'm sure, and on the agent side. So I'm guessing this isn't some phenomenon you're seeing outside of the U.S. Is it more prevalent in certain markets than others globally?
No, I think we're seeing people try to shift to open plan environments globally. If that phone call coming in is an escalation, we're seeing that absolutely everywhere. Many organizations are realizing that they can't have just one person solve it. They need some collaboration in place. And that low barriers, open environment is designed to encourage that collaboration. But what we just find at the moment is that it just raises the noise floor.
Good things to consider. So last question, what do you say to a center that, maybe they're open and they're using product that maybe is a little older, 5 years, 7 years older? Is that makes them obsolete or unsafe?
No, not in the slightest. But like I said, we've had protection built into our headsets for about 40 years now. So we actually have heard examples of some of our headsets lasting that long in contact centers. But if they've bought a professional headset in the last 20 years, it will have protection built into them. But what we're seeing as a best practice now is, how do you prove that? What do you do next to actually make sure that you're showing the employees, that you're showing the occupational health and safety teams, and engaging with them on this? Back to your point about continuing those employee engagement programs. How do we make sure that we're engaging with them to show that we're looking after them through this new area of, or this rising concern that we're seeing within the contact center? That's, it's driven by a good cause. The idea of open offices and collaboration is great. But we're seeing from the open offices trend that at the moment it's destroying collaboration because it's this increased noise floor. And in an open office, great, you can go and move, you can go and work elsewhere. In the contact center, you can't do that. You've got to be on the phone. So how do we really make sure those employees are getting the best deal and giving the best service to the customer?
Well, it's certainly not anything that anyone's brought up recently that I've heard. Is there more information if people are looking to get a little more detail on this? Is there access to information on the Plantronics website?
Yes, there is. And actually, we've just timely. We've just launched a product fairly recently that will help people start to look at the acoustic levels that their employees have had and engage with those health and safety teams on a proactive basis. We've got quite a bit in there on our site about this whole absorption, blocking, and control approach as well, starting to give people some ideas about, okay, how do I go and look at the background noise? And if you get the chance, we've actually put this in practice into some of our own offices. So there's some videos on our site about how we set up our own offices with the different zones, the different acoustic areas for people to work in. And there's some great examples on there of how organizations can, even take small steps towards doing something about this.
Great. We will we'll provide access point from this video and drive people to the sub parts of the website so they can get that information. Richard, again, you're 14 years of this stuff, right? Yeah, it's always a lot of fun to sit down and talk to you and see where you're at and what you're up to. I know you're doing a lot of traveling, and next time you're in the States, let us know. We'd love to have you in a live manner stand in front of a group and answer some questions. But in the meantime, we're gonna drive people to and encourage people to dial into these video interviews as well as download the content from your website. So thank you so much for your time again today.
Thank you again, David.
All the best.
Thanks.